In the flickering neon glow of a small Ohio diner, a black nurse faced vicious racism from a group of bikers who mocked her scrubs as a costume, until her fearless response unveiled a truth that silenced their taunts and sparked a powerful reckoning of respect. Maya adjusted the collar of her faded blue scrubs, the fabric worn thin from countless shifts. Her shoulders ached from a grueling 12-hour day at Mercy General Hospital. The faint scent of antiseptic still clung to her skin as she pulled her beat-up sedan into the parking lot of Rosie's Diner, a modest roadside stop off Route 52 in Ohio. It was just past 8 p.m., and the sky had darkened to a bruised purple, the horizon streaked with faint traces of orange. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a red and blue glow across the gravel lot. Maya wanted nothing more than a quiet meal before heading home to collapse into bed. She stepped out of her car, her sneakers scuffing against the rough gravel, and pushed open the diner's creaky door with a sigh of exhaustion. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of grease and freshly brewed coffee. The hum of a ceiling fan mixed with the clatter of dishes and the low murmur of conversation. A few truckers sat at the counter, their weathered hands wrapped around steaming mugs, hunched over plates of pie and fries. A family of three, a mother, father, and a young girl with pigtails, laughed softly in a booth near the window, their voices a gentle contrast to the diner's otherwise weary ambiance. Maya scanned the room, her dark eyes settling on a small table near the back. It was tucked away, partially hidden by a jukebox that played a faint country tune, its lights flickering with every note. She wanted to be left alone, to decompress after a day of saving lives. She slid into the chair, her name tag, Maya Ellis, RN, still pinned to her scrubs, the metal glinting faintly under the dim overhead lights. She ordered a hot drink and a burger, her voice soft but firm as she spoke to the waitress. Her mind drifted to the patients she'd cared for today. There was Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman with kind eyes, who'd squeezed her hand after a tough procedure, her frail voice whispering, "You're a blessing, child." The memory brought a faint smile to Maya's lips, a small warmth in the midst of her exhaustion. She thought of the young boy in the ER, barely 6 years old, who'd clung to her hand as she stitched a gash on his forehead, his mother crying softly in the corner. Maya had stayed late to make sure he was okay, her own dinner forgotten in the chaos of the hospital. She remembered the gratitude in the mother's eyes, the way she'd whispered, "Thank you for saving him," as Maya finally left the room, her scrubs stained with the day's battles. Now here she was, finally taking a moment for herself, her body heavy with the weight of the day, but her spirit lifted by the lives she'd touched. She thought back to her early days as a nurse, the long hours of training, the nights she'd spent studying while working 2 jobs to pay for school. She'd always known she wanted to help people, to make a difference in a world that often felt cold and unkind. But she hadn't anticipated the challenges that came with being a black nurse in a small town. The sideways glances, the whispered comments, the patients who demanded a real nurse, as if her skin color erased her qualification. She'd fought through it all, her determination a quiet fire that burned brighter with every obstacle. She'd earned her place at Mercy General, had saved countless lives. And yet, sitting here in this diner, she felt the familiar weight of being seen as less than she was. The diner's door slammed open, the sound jarring against the quiet hum of the room. A group of 5 men strode in, their heavy boots thumping against the linoleum floor. They wore leather jackets adorned with patches, American flags, eagles, and insignias that screamed veteran pride. Their laughter was loud, brash, filling the space as they claimed a booth near the counter. The leader, a wiry man with a graying ponytail and a scar across his cheek, carried himself with an air of authority, his shoulders squared as if he owned the place. His jacket was the most decorated, patches sewn haphazardly across the leather, each one a badge of his perceived superiority. The other men followed his lead, their voices booming as they called for beers, their presence dominating the diner like a storm rolling in. Maya glanced at them briefly, her dark eyes taking in their weathered faces and the way they carried themselves. The leader's scar caught her attention. It ran from his cheekbone to his jaw, a jagged line that told a story of its own. She quickly turned back to her drink, hoping to stay invisible. She stirred the steaming liquid with a spoon, watching the ripples spread across the surface, trying to focus on the warmth of the cup in her hands, but the leader caught sight of her. His eyes narrowed, a smirk curling his lips as he muttered something to his group. Their laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on the room. A chill ran down Maya's spine. She knew that look, the kind that judged without knowing, the kind that had followed her all her life. It was a look she'd seen in the eyes of patients who'd questioned her competence, in the sneers of strangers who'd crossed the street to avoid her. It was a look that carried the weight of prejudice, and it made her stomach twist with a familiar dread. The family in the booth fell silent, their laughter fading as they sensed the shift in the air. The truckers at the counter glanced over their shoulders, their expressions unreadable but their postures tense. The jukebox played on, its melody a stark contrast to the growing unease that rippled through the diner. Maya took a slow sip of her drink, her hand steady despite the racing of her heart. She wanted to believe they'd leave her alone, that they'd focus on their beers and their stories, but deep down, she knew better. She'd been here before, in moments where the color of her skin made her a target, where her hard-earned scrubs became a point of mockery rather than pride. She braced herself, her fingers tightening around the cup as the leader's smirk grew wider. His eyes locked on her like a predator sizing up its prey. The leader's smirk deepened, a cruel edge to it that made Maya's skin prickle. He leaned toward his group, his voice low but sharp enough for her to catch every word. "Look at her, playing dress-up in those scrubs. Probably stole 'em from a laundry cart to get a free meal. Ain't no way someone like her is a real nurse." The men chuckled, their laughter grating against the diner's quiet hum, each sound a dagger to Maya's pride. Her fingers tightened around her steaming cup, the warmth doing little to ease the cold knot forming in her chest. Her heart sank with the familiar sting of being dismissed. She'd heard worse. Patients who'd refused her care because of her skin. Colleagues who'd whispered behind her back about her, quote, quotas. But it never got easier. The weight of their words pressed down on her, a heavy reminder of the battles she fought every day. She remembered her first year at Mercy General, a patient who'd sneered at her, saying, "I don't want your kind touching me," his voice dripping with venom as he demanded a white nurse. She'd stood there, her hands trembling with rage, but she'd kept her composure, her voice steady as she explained she was the only nurse available. She'd saved his life that night, pulling him through a heart attack. But he'd never thanked her, never even looked her in the eye. The memory burned in her mind, a scar that hadn't faded, and Vince's words tore it open anew. She kept her gaze on the table, her dark eyes tracing the grain of the wood, hoping they'd lose interest and move on. They didn't. The leader, whose jacket bore a patch reading Vince, stood up with a deliberate slowness that made Maya's stomach churn. His boots thudded against the linoleum as he approached her table, his group trailing behind like a pack of wolves. The diner grew quieter, the air thick with tension. The family in the booth glanced over, their faces etched with unease, the young girl clutching her mother's arm as if sensing the danger. The truckers at the counter stopped, mid-bite, their forks hovering over their plates, their eyes darting between Maya and the approaching men. Vince stopped a few feet from Maya's table, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture radiating arrogance. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with mockery, each word a calculated jab. "Nice costume. You supposed to be a nurse or something? Where's your stethoscope? Leave it at the Halloween store?" His buddies laughed again, their voices a harsh chorus that echoed through the diner. One of them, a stocky man with a faded eagle tattoo on his forearm, added, "Bet she couldn't even tell a bandage from a bedsheet." Another chimed in, his voice slurred from too many beers. "They'll let anyone wear scrubs these days. Probably just here to scam some poor fool into paying her tab." Maya's jaw tightened, her teeth grinding together as she fought to keep her composure. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting Vince's, a storm brewing behind her steady gaze. "I am a nurse," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. each word a quiet defiance against their cruelty. "And I'm just trying to eat my dinner," Vince scoffed, leaning closer, his shadow falling across her table like a dark cloud. His breath smelled of cheap beer, the sour scent invading her space as he sneered. "A nurse? Huh. I've seen real nurses, and they don't look like you. You think I'm stupid? They only hired you 'cause they had to fill a quota. Bet you can't even read a chart right." The words hit Maya like a slap, sharp and stinging, each syllable a blatant attack on her race and her worth. Her heart pounded with a mix of hurt and anger, the emotions swirling together in a tempest she struggled to contain. She thought of the lives she'd saved, the sleepless nights in the ER, the blood and sweat she'd poured into her work. She remembered the mother who'd thanked her through tears after Maya had stabilized her son, the elderly man who'd called her his guardian angel after she'd caught a complication just in time. All of that reduced to a cruel joke by a man who didn't even know her name. Across the counter, a waitress named Clara watched the scene unfold. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a faded apron, her hands weathered from years of serving coffee and wiping down tables. Clara had served Maya before, always with a kind smile, often slipping an extra slice of pie onto her plate after a long shift. She knew Maya's story, knew she was a nurse at Mercy General, had seen her rushing in after late shifts, her scrubs stained with the day's battles. But more than that, Clara knew what it felt like to be judged. Years ago, she'd watched her own brother, a mechanic with dreams of owning his own shop, be turned away from job after job because of his skin color. The memory had stayed with her, a quiet ache that fueled her sense of justice. She winced at Vince's words, her fingers tightening around the rag she held, her heart heavy with a mix of guilt/anguille noi tieng. She whispered to a coworker, a young man named Tommy who was washing dishes in the back. "She's a nurse at Mercy General. I've seen her there, saving lives." Her voice was low, laced with a quiet fury, but her words were a small spark of hope in the darkness of the moment. Claire's disapproval stirred something in the diner, a subtle shift in the air that Maya felt even as she sat under Vince's looming shadow. The truckers at the counter exchanged glances, their expressions darkening as they listened to Vince's taunts. The father in the booth pulled his daughter closer, his jaw tight as he whispered something to his wife, their eyes never leaving the scene. The jukebox played on, its melody a faint backdrop to the storm brewing in Maya's chest. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she set her cup down, the ceramic clinking softly against the table. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let Vince's words define her. She'd fought too hard, given too much, to let a man like him strip away her pride. Vince's voice grew louder, cutting through the diner like a blade. "Let's be real. You're no nurse. You're just here fishing for attention, aren't you? People like you always looking for a handout." His words were a deliberate jab, each syllable laced with venom that made Maya's blood boil. Her eyes blazed with a fire that had been simmering since the moment he'd approached, a mix of anger and hurt swirling behind her unyielding gaze. The injustice felt like a weight threatening to crush her, a heavy reminder of every time she'd been reduced to a stereotype. Her mind flashed to the countless nights she'd spent in the ER, holding the hands of dying patients, comforting families through their worst moments. She'd sat with a teenage girl who'd been in a car accident, whispering reassurances as she fought to stabilize her. The girl's mother sobbing in the hallway. She'd stayed past her shift, her hands steady as she adjusted the IV, her voice calm as she told the girl, "You're going to be okay, sweetheart." The girl had survived, and her mother had hugged Maya so tightly she could barely breathe, tears soaking into her scrubs as she whispered, "You're an angel." All of that erased by a man who didn't even know her name. Maya's chest tightened, the pain of Vince's words slicing through her like a scalpel. She thought of an incident from her early days at Mercy General, a memory that still stung like a fresh wound. A patient, an older man with a scowl etched into his face, had taken one look at her and sneered, "I don't want some charity hire touching me. Get me a real nurse." His words had echoed through the hospital room, the other staff members glancing away, their silence a heavy weight. Maya had stood there, her hands trembling with a mix of rage and humiliation, her throat tight as she fought back the tears that threatened to spill. She'd kept her composure, her voice steady as she explained she was the only nurse available, but inside she'd felt small, diminished, as if her years of training meant nothing in the face of his prejudice. She'd saved his life that night, pulling him through a heart attack, but he'd never thanked her, never even looked her in the eye as he was discharged. The memory burned in her mind, a scar that Vince's words tore open, a reminder of the battles she fought not just in the ER, but in a world that too often judged her by her skin. That moment had stayed with her, fueling her determination to prove her worth, but also leaving a quiet ache that never fully faded. The diner's patrons shifted uncomfortably, their unease palpable in the heavy silence that followed Vince's outburst. The family in the booth whispered to each other, the mother's eyes wide with worry as she pulled her daughter closer, her hands trembling slightly. The young girl, clutching a small stuffed bear, looked up at her mother with wide eyes, her voice barely a whisper as she asked, "Why is he being so mean to her, Mommy?" The mother shushed her gently, but her own expression mirrored her daughter's confusion, a mix of fear and sympathy flickering across her face. The truckers at the counter froze, their hands gripping their mugs, their faces a mix of shock and disapproval. One of them, a man with a faded tattoo of an anchor on his forearm, shook his head slowly, his jaw tight as he watched the scene unfold, his knuckles whitening around his coffee mug as he muttered something under his breath. Maya's hands clenched into fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. The shame of being publicly humiliated was a bitter pill she refused to swallow, a searing pain that clawed at her chest, threatening to overwhelm her. Her heart pounded with a realization. She had to fight back, or let this moment define her as a victim. She thought of her patients, their trust in her, their gratitude. She remembered a father who'd hugged her after she'd saved his son, his voice breaking as he said, "You gave me my boy back." She'd been up for 18 hours that day, her body screaming for rest, but she'd stayed, her hands steady as she monitored the boy's vitals, her mind focused, despite the exhaustion. She couldn't let Vince's ignorance taint that, couldn't let his words strip away the pride she'd earned through years of sacrifice. Clara the waitress took a step closer to the scene, her faded apron swaying slightly with her movement. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tray, her knuckles white from the pressure, her conscience battling her fear of getting involved. She'd seen enough injustice in her life, had watched her brother be torn down by men like Vince, and the memory pushed her forward. She remembered the day her brother had come home, his face bruised, his spirit broken, after a group of men had cornered him outside a bar, calling him names she couldn't bear to repeat. He'd given up his dream of owning a shop after that, the fight drained out of him by the cruelty of others. Clara had vowed then to never stay silent again, and now, seeing Maya face the same hatred, she felt that promise stir within her. She finally spoke, her voice shaky but firm, cutting through the tension like a lifeline. "She's telling the truth. She works at Mercy General. I've seen her there, saving lives." Her words were a quiet rebellion, a small act of defiance that carried the weight of her own pain. They shifted the room's energy, a ripple of hope that spread through the diner like a wave, a beacon in the darkness of the moment. Vince turned to Clara, his smirk faltering for a moment, his eyes narrowing with irritation. "Stay out of this, lady," he snapped, his voice sharp, but there was a flicker of doubt in his gaze, a crack in his bravado that Maya noticed. His hand twitched at his side, as if he were unsure whether to lash out or back down, his confidence shaken by Clara's words. Maya seized the lifeline Clara had thrown her, her resolve hardening like steel. Her voice rose with renewed strength, steady and unyielding as she stood up from her chair, her scrubs a testament to her truth. "I don't need to prove myself to you," she said, her tone cutting through the air like a blade, each word a declaration of her worth. Her gaze locked onto Vince's with defiance, a fire burning in her that made him take a half-step back, his boots scraping against the linoleum. The tension in the diner crackled like a storm about to break, every patron holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. A trucker at the counter, a burly man named Joe with a graying beard, set down his mug with a quiet thud, the sound echoing in the stillness. He'd been listening, his own memories of prejudice stirring a quiet anger within him. He'd grown up in a small town much like this one, had watched his father be turned away from jobs because of his accent, his heritage dismissed with a sneer. Joe's father had been a hard-working man, an immigrant who'd come to America with nothing but a dream, only to be met with closed doors and cruel words. Joe had been just a boy then, but the pain of those moments had never left him, and seeing Maya face the same hatred ignited a fire in his chest. He muttered to himself, his voice low but firm, "This ain't right." His disapproval was another spark of hope, a sign that Maya wasn't alone. The other truckers nodded in silent agreement, their expressions darkening as they watched Vince, their hands tightening around their forks, their anger at the injustice fueling their readiness to intervene if the situation escalated. Joe's words, though quiet, set the stage for a reckoning Maya hadn't anticipated, a moment where the tide began to turn. Vince's smirk returned, sharper and meaner, his pride wounded by Maya's defiance. He lunged forward, his hand reaching for her collar, his fingers brushing the fabric of her scrubs. "Let's see if you're as tough as you talk, girl." His movement was clumsy, fueled by bravado and the beers he'd downed, his breath hot with anger, his eyes wild with a mix of rage and arrogance. He wanted to reassert his dominance, to prove to his group and to himself that he wasn't shaken by Maya's words or Clara's interference. But Maya didn't flinch. Years of working in high-pressure ERs had honed her instincts, had taught her to stay calm in the face of chaos, to act quickly when lives were on the line. She'd faced combative patients, frantic family members, and emergencies that demanded split-second decisions. Vince was nothing compared to the challenges she'd overcome. With a swift, precise motion, she sidestepped his grab, catching his wrist mid-air, her grip firm and unyielding. In one fluid movement, she twisted his arm behind his back, using his momentum to pin him against the edge of her table. The wood creaked under his weight as Vince let out a strangled yelp, his bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. The diner erupted in gasps, the sound a collective release of the tension that had been building since Vince first approached Maya's table. The family in the booth stared, their mouths slightly open, the young girl's eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. The truckers at the counter leaned forward, their expressions shifting from concern to admiration, one of them letting out a low whistle as he watched Maya hold Vince in place. Another trucker, a wiry man with a faded cap, turned to his companion and muttered, "She's got guts." "I'll give her that," his voice gruff but laced with respect. Maya leaned in, her voice low and controlled, each word carrying the weight of every life she'd saved, every crisis she'd navigated. "I told you, I'm a nurse, and I've dealt with worse than you in the ER." Her words dropped like a thunderclap, a declaration of her strength that reverberated through the room, a sound that seemed to echo off the walls, silencing every whisper, every breath. Vince's group froze, their wide-eyed stares fixed on their immobilized leader, their laughter dying in their throats as they stood motionless, realizing their leader had been bested. Maya released Vince with a controlled shove, her movements deliberate, her strength undeniable. He stumbled forward, clutching his arm, his face red with humiliation, his scar standing out starkly against his flushed skin. The diner fell silent, every head turned to Maya, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. Her identity as a nurse was no longer in question. It was a force they hadn't seen coming, a power that shifted the balance of the room in an instant. A teenage girl in the family booth whispered to her mom, her voice barely audible but filled with wonder, "She's amazing." Her mother nodded, her eyes shining with awe, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched Maya stand tall, her presence a beacon of resilience in the dim light of the diner. The father in the booth, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward, his wife quiet but firm as he said to his wife, "She's a hero. Look at how she handled that." His words were a testament to the shift in perception, a recognition of Maya's worth that rippled through the room, a quiet acknowledgement that she'd changed the way they saw her. Maya's scrubs, once a target of mockery, now stood as a symbol of her resilience, the faded blue fabric a testament to her unwavering dedication, the name tag, Maya Ellis, RN, glinting faintly under the overhead lights. She addressed Vince, her voice steady but laced with quiet fury, her presence commanding the room like a beacon in the storm. "You don't get to decide who I am. I've saved lives in this community, maybe even someone you know." The words hit Vince like a slap, sharp and unyielding, cutting through his defenses like a knife through butter. His earlier confidence crumbled, his shoulders slumping as he stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief, his voice barely a whisper. You can't be..." He trailed off, his mind racing, his hands trembling, as he tried to process what Maya had just said, the weight of her words sinking in like a stone. Maya stepped closer, her gaze never wavering, her voice steady as she delivered the final blow, a revelation that would change everything. "Last year, I led the trauma team that saved a biker after a crash on Route 52. He had a jacket just like yours, patches and all. I didn't care who he was. I fought for him. That's who I am." The twist landed hard, a revelation that struck Vince like a physical blow, his face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process her words, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. He remembered that crash, his brother had been the one pulled from the wreckage, his body broken and bleeding on the side of the road, his leather jacket torn and stained with blood. Vince had been there when they'd gotten the call, his heart pounding with fear as he'd raced to the hospital, his mind filled with images of his brother lying lifeless on a stretcher. The doctors had said a nurse had refused to give up, had fought for him through the night, her hands steady as she'd brought him back from the brink. Vince had visited his brother in the hospital, had seen the gratitude in his eyes as he'd whispered, "She wouldn't let me go," his voice weak but filled with awe. That nurse had been Maya. The realization hit him like a freight train, his knees buckling slightly as he gripped the table for support, his world tilting on its axis, a wave of guilt and shame crashing over him as he understood the depth of his mistake. Vince sank back into his booth, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The faint creak of the vinyl seat beneath him betrayed the unease that coursed through his body, a stark contrast to the brash confidence he'd exuded just moments ago. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a stunned silence that hung heavy in the air, as if the weight of Maya's revelation had stripped him of his voice. He struggled to process the truth she'd unveiled, his mind racing with the image of his brother, broken and bleeding on Route 52, clinging to life because of the woman he'd just mocked. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a boulder, each breath a reminder of the harm he'd caused. His gaze darted between Maya and his group, the murmurs of the diner's patrons a constant stinging reminder of the scene he'd created, their whispers a chorus of judgment he couldn't escape. Maya turned to him, her expression softening just enough to offer a chance at redemption, but her posture remained firm, unyielding. Her voice was steady, laced with the authority she'd earned through years of saving lives, a tone that carried the weight of her resilience. "I'm giving you a choice, Vince," she said, her words echoing through the diner with a quiet power that silenced the murmurs. "Acknowledge your bias and leave me in peace, or I'll make sure this diner and this town knows exactly who you are." Her statement was a challenge, a call for accountability that left no room for excuses. A mirror held up to Vince's actions that he couldn't look away from. Inside, Maya felt a surge of pride, a fire that burned brighter than ever, fueled by the knowledge that she'd not only defended herself but also honored the countless patients who'd trusted her with their lives. She thought of Mrs. Carter, the elderly woman from her shift that day, whose frail hand had squeezed hers with gratitude, her voice a whisper as she'd said, "You're a blessing, child." That moment had reminded Maya why she'd chosen this path, a path that Vince had tried to diminish but couldn't erase, a path that now stood as a testament to her strength. Vince hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his situation, a battle that played out in the tense set of his jaw and the flicker of shame in his expression. His mind flashed to his brother, lying in a hospital bed at Mercy General, tubes snaking from his arms, his face pale but alive. He remembered the doctor's words, spoken with a mix of exhaustion and relief. The nurse in charge fought for him. She wouldn't let him go. Vince had been too overwhelmed with gratitude to ask her name, but he'd seen the determination in her stance when he'd passed her in the hallway. Her scrubs stained with sweat and blood, her focus unbreakable. That nurse had been Maya. The realization stung with bitter clarity, a sharp pang of regret rising in his throat like bile. He saw the depth of his error, the harm he'd caused, not just to Maya but to the memory of his brother's survival, a memory he'd tainted with his own prejudice. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as he nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the table. His voice was low and shaky, a jagged whisper that carried the weight of his shame. I was wrong, he admitted, the confession tearing at his pride like a blade. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Maya nodded in acknowledgement, her heart feeling lighter as she absorbed his words. The apology a small but significant step toward healing the wound he'd inflicted. The tension in her shoulders eased, a quiet relief washing over her like a gentle wave, soothing the raw edges of her earlier anger. It mingled with the pride that still burned within her, a fire now tempered by a sense of fulfillment, a knowledge that she'd turned a moment of hatred into one of reckoning. She turned to the diner's patrons, her presence commanding as she spoke, each word a testament to her resilience. I'm a nurse. I save lives. And I'll keep doing it no matter what anyone thinks of me. The diner erupted into applause, the sound a symphony of support that filled the room, a collective acknowledgement of her courage. The trucker Joe clapped fiercely, his gruff voice cutting through the noise as he called out, "You're a hero!" He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked over to Maya, offering her a firm handshake, his rough hand a symbol of the respect he now held for her. Clara, wiping a tear from her cheek with the corner of her faded apron, gave Maya a small nod, her hands trembling with admiration, her lips trembling as she whispered to herself, "She's incredible." She then set down her tray, walked over, and placed a fresh cup of coffee on Maya's table, a quiet gesture of gratitude for the courage she'd witnessed. From the perspective of the teenage girl in the family booth, Maya's words were a revelation, a lesson in strength she'd never forget. The girl had watched the entire scene unfold, her small hands clutching her mother's arm, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and awe. Now, as she saw Maya stand tall, her scrubs a symbol of her unwavering dedication, the girl felt a spark of inspiration ignite within her. She turned to her mother, her voice soft but filled with determination. "I want to be like her when I grow up." Her mother smiled, her own expression misty with emotion, and squeezed her daughter's hand, a silent promise that she'd support her dream. Vince's group shuffled out quietly, their heads bowed, their earlier arrogance replaced by a humbled silence, leaving Maya to finish her meal in peace, the burger and coffee now a quiet victory she savored with every bite. 2 years later, Rosie's Diner had transformed into a symbol of change in the small Ohio town, its once faded walls now a testament to the power of courage and kindness. They were adorned with a framed photo of Maya, a gift from the community honoring the night she'd stood up to prejudice and sparked a movement. The diner had started a monthly Heroes Night, inviting nurses, firefighters, and other unsung heroes to share their stories, their voices filling the space with tales of resilience and hope. Maya's actions had ignited a shift, ensuring that no one would be judged by their appearance again, a legacy that rippled through the town like a wave. Her gaze softened with emotion as she traced the edge of the frame with her fingertip, the cool metal, a grounding contrast to the warmth in her chest, the memory of that night stirring a quiet pride that had only grown with time. She thought of her first patient at Mercy General, a young boy who'd called her his angel, after she'd stayed by his side through a grueling surgery, his small hand clutching hers as he'd whispered, "Thank you." That promise to serve had led her here, to a legacy she'd never imagined, a beacon of hope for a community that had once turned a blind eye to injustice. Maya, now a respected advocate for healthcare equity, worked closely with Clara, who'd become a community organizer for Heroes Night, her once timid demeanor replaced by a quiet confidence that shone through in every action. Clara's guilt from that night had fueled her passion, a fire that had burned away her fear and ignited a new purpose. Her voice was steady as she welcomed guests, her hands no longer trembling as she handed out flyers, the paper crisp and bright with the promise of change. Her laughter filled the air during events, a sound Maya cherished as a reminder of their bond, a melody of healing that echoed through the diner. Clara had even started a small fund during Heroes Night, collecting donations to support local nursing students, a tangible act of kindness inspired by Maya's courage. Joe the trucker had become a regular volunteer, his own experiences with prejudice driving his commitment, a dedication that had softened the edges of his gruff exterior. He pitched ideas for outreach, his voice steady as he suggested ways to expand Heroes Night, his hands, once clenched in anger, now holding posters for the next event, their edges slightly crumpled from his eager grip. Joe had also taken to mentoring young volunteers at the events, sharing stories of his own journey to teach them the value of standing up against injustice, a quiet act of giving back that honored Maya's impact. At a regional healthcare conference, Maya stood on stage, her scrubs replaced by a sharp blazer that spoke of her new role, a symbol of the authority she'd earned through her tireless advocacy. Her voice was steady as she addressed the crowd, her presence commanding, a fire burning within her that had only grown brighter with time. "Respect isn't a privilege. It's a right," she declared, her tone resolute, each word carrying the weight of her journey, a call to action that resonated through the room. Clara watched from the audience, her heart swelling with pride, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she listened to the woman who'd changed her life. The woman who'd once feared speaking out was now a champion for change. Her own journey a testament to the ripple effect of Maya's courage, a legacy that had inspired her to find her own voice. The applause was a symphony of hope that filled the room, a sound that carried the promise of a better future, a future where kindness and courage could overcome any divide. From the perspective of the young nurses who filled the conference hall, Maya was a hero, a shining example that courage and kindness could overcome any bias. Their applause reverberated beyond the room, a wave of inspiration that touched each of them in its own way. One young nurse, a Filipino man in his early 30s, felt a deep connection to Maya's story, his own experiences with prejudice flashing through his mind like a reel of painful memories. He remembered a patient who'd refused his care, sneering, "I don't trust foreigners with my health," the words a dagger that had pierced his confidence. But Maya's words gave him strength, a reminder that his worth wasn't defined by others' biases. His pen paused over his notebook, his hand trembling slightly as he whispered to a colleague, "She's why I'll keep fighting." His resolve mirrored Maya's own, a fire that would shape the future of healthcare in ways she couldn't yet foresee, a legacy that would live on through every life he touched. Maya's story reached beyond the conference hall, touching the hearts of those who heard it, a story of justice that could heal the deepest divides. Dear viewer, her journey reminds us of the power we hold to make a difference, the power to turn bias into a moment of strength. Have you ever faced prejudice and transformed it into a moment of triumph? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear your victories just like Maya's, stories that remind us of the resilience we all carry within us. If this story touched you like this video, subscribe and hit the bell for more tales of justice and kindness, stories that inspire us to build a world where respect isn't a dream but a reality. Change begins with you, with every heart we lift, with every step we take toward a better tomorrow, a tomorrow where courage and kindness reign.